Chapter 13 Sentinel. For once, Flark had followed his pilot's training with accuracy. The inner airlock of the base clicked open, and the Ogron crew barged through noisily. If there was one thing a group of Ogrons could be relied upon to do well, it was to barge noisily through an airlock. The guard Ogron gave a clumsy salute of greeting to his comrades.
"Welcome to Planet 11. You have good journey?"
Flark nodded.
"Journey good and safe. Where are the Mr. Nisbets?" "In survey room. I will lead you."
The Ogrons followed him away from the airlock. On the opposite side of the base, halfway along one of the arms that faced away from the landing pad, a large hatch set a few meters above the ground slid back and the base's skimmer emerged. It had been used by the survey team on computer-guided reconnaissance missions in the locality of the base. It was about 20 meters long by 10 wide, and its silver paintwork was scarred and soiled by the various tasks it had undertaken. The upswept tail section contained 2 large rocket thrusters designed to provide maximum resistance against the dense atmosphere. At the front was a clear bubble of plastiglass, which was doused constantly by automatic sprinklers. Inside the bubble, at the guidance controls of the skimmer, sat Pierpoint. His long, bony fingers tapped confidently at the navigation panel, keying in a sequence of coordinates he had memorized for just such an eventuality. Next to him, on the padded seating, lay the body of Romana, still unconscious, her head thrown back. The glittering mask of Zeus, unmoving, was framed by her long, blonde hair. The skimmer's motors responded to its new instructions and turned the tapered snout of the vehicle to face its destination. The rocket ports glared red, and the skimmer shot through the gas clouds. On the second row of seating, behind Pierpoint and Romana, a bulky, irregular shape was covered by an oil-spattered tarpaulin. As the skimmer rocked and banked, the tarpaulin lifted for a second. Stokes' terrified face was revealed. The doctor was still leading Charlie Nisbet in a macabre pas de deux around the survey room, neatly circling around the remains of Margo and Eddie.
"Who tipped you off about this operation?" Charlie snarled. "Was it the judge man, old Pierpoint?"
"Oh no," said the doctor. "Nobody tipped me off. I'm just a natural blunderer. If there's trouble, I'll find it." He coughed nervously. "As for old Pierpoint, well, he's the man you want to be chasing about with a gun." Charlie stopped and straightened up.
"Perhaps you're right."
"Thank goodness," the doctor said and pointed over his shoulder. "He went that way."
"I'd better tidy up in here first, though,"
said Charlie. He raised his revolver and pointed it directly at the doctor's left heart.
"You talk too much. Me old mum used to say empty sand shakers make the most clatter."
The doctor prepared himself to jump Charlie. Just as he was about to spring, a crowd of Ogrons burst into the survey room. Flark stopped in shock at the sight of the 2 bodies.
"Mr. Edward!"
Charlie turned to face his boys, the doctor momentarily forgotten.
"Where have you been?"
Flark wrung his huge, hairy hands.
"We had trouble with the docking clamps again."
"I don't want to hear about your flamin' clamps,"
Charlie stormed.
"Me only brother is lying dead on that floor. We've got to nail the villain that did it."
The doctor used the opportunity of this distraction to pick up the probe relay unit discarded earlier by Zeus. He consulted the readout screen, did a few mental calculations, and shook his head ruefully. "That villain has done a lot more than any of us anticipated." He wiggled the device at Charlie. "Somebody has sucked this planet clean of Helicon, mined out the seam in the Gilharo Mountains, and cleared up the rest of the planet using selective gathering bugs, before this survey had even begun. Now, the only person with the information, the opportunity, and the motive to do all of that is Pierpoint."
"But he's the law," Charlie said. "And what would he want with Helicon?"
The doctor decided to take advantage of his temporary favor and sat down before the main console. "Well, he's totally corrupt, for one thing," he told Charlie. "A greater danger to the system than your firm ever was, or ever could have been, precisely because he was working from inside the law. And as for the Helicon, He punched up a picture from one of the base's external cameras. The rear of a skimmer was plowing away through the grime.
Through Zeus, he can use it to unlock powers more dangerous than anything this sector of space has seen. I think he's off to collect it.
He looked around, a worried expression creeping over his features.
Where's Romana?
Coordinates are aligned with course program.
K9 pronounced grandly.
Materialization commencing.
The central column of the TARDIS ground to a halt. Spigot, who was getting used to some of the time ship's more basic functions, twisted the scanner control and the big shutters slid open. Their immediate environment was a large and apparently empty room that was lined with quiescent mining technology. Large drills sat upended on a central work table, their coils blunted and smeared by overuse. A twisted rubber belt 5 feet wide was wrapped around a stanchion on the floor. Smaller tools were ranged in clips along the facing wall. Light came from a photophores disc in the ceiling.
Ah, a storage and repair area, right?
Mused Spigot. He reached for the door control.
All set for a look about, K9.
Life support systems inactive, but residual oxygen and temperature sufficient.
The dog replied.
Open doors.
His blaster raised, Spigot stepped cautiously from the TARDIS into the repair room.
Well, nobody about.
He crossed to the table and picked up an engine part that was covered in flaking rust.
This looks like it could be part of a centrifuge, or separator or something.
Your analysis is likely,
said K9. Spigot replaced the components.
You don't have to sound so surprised.
He noticed a communicator system as he crossed the room to a large machine that stood in the corner. The machine was 10 feet tall, painted white, and was featureless, except for a central section of flashing controls and 2 slits just above.
What do you reckon on this, though?
Spigot asked. He reached up and patted the machine.
It's a big one, whatever it is. Could be a recharger.
K9 trundled forward and extended the probe.
Caution,
he said.
Function of this machine is to supervise the sorting of ore. It has reasoning intelligence circuits and is programmed to resist unauthorized interference.
Spigot waved a hand dismissively.
Get off, K9. It's a recharger, right enough. I've seen some like this before. They have to be big to channel so much energy.
He tapped the machine's central panel.
See, you put your charge leads in these sockets, right? And press this button here.
Danger!
K9 shrieked.
Do not activate this machine!
Spigot pressed the button. The slits on the machine's top section flashed bright green. A whirring noise came from deep inside it.
It's just a recharger,
Spigot said, a little less confidently.
Don't worry about it.
There were a series of short, sharp clicks from inside the machine, and it started to unfold like a living deck chair. 3 white blocks appeared and formed arms. At the end of each was a different mining tool, a scoop, a saw, and a long serrated implement that quivered menacingly. The entire lower section sank down on an inflating circular base. The head swiveled from side to side, a pneumatic hiss accompanying its movements.
I suppose I was wrong,
said Spigot. He leapt back towards the TARDIS, to which K9 was already retreating. The robot advanced. It seemed to know what they were trying to do, and a green ray shot from its eyes and bounced off the TARDIS. Apparently irritated by this disappointing result, it advanced smoothly on its circular base and fired again, this time directly at its opponents. Spigot ducked and followed K9 towards the door of the repair room. They tumbled through and the door closed. Spigot thumbed the locking panel beside it and leaned panting against the wall.
K9, he said, you have official permission not to listen to a word I say.
I do not need official permission,
K9 said testily and set off along the adjoining corridor. Spigot raced after him. The door of the repair room was blasted off its hinges moments later. The mighty robot pushed itself through the doorway and set off after them, its eyes flashing fiercely. Gajork and his 2 colleagues in the mining party stood waiting for further orders from their masters. They were used to long delays between sets of orders. It was always the same, whomever you were working for. A roaring engine noise was suddenly overlaid on the rumble of the swirling gas clouds. Each of the Ogrons heard it through his helmet and looked up curiously to its point of origin. Their eyes widened in astonishment, and they gave puzzled grunts. A dark shape was swooping down through the clouds at alarming speed. Confused, Gjork took a couple of clumsy, Atmos-suited strides forward. It wasn't their ship coming in so low, and the Masters would have said if they were coming over. The flying shape was turning round now, but still heading directly at them. The other two mining Ogrons panicked and started to run. Gjork stood his ground. He decided to call his Masters and find out what was going on. They were sure to have an answer.
Mr. Charles,
he began.
Gjork is speaking.
The thundering rocket ports of the vehicle came closer.
There is big thing here, sir, with big flames coming from it. What is it?
A ball of jettisoned fuel waste dropped from the rocket ports of the skimmer. It ignited the atmosphere immediately, and Gjork and his colleagues were swallowed up by the conflagration within seconds. The fireball spun and sizzled for a few moments, then folded in on itself, trailing a squall of black fumes and cinders that were the only remains of the Ogron miners.
What's going on out there?
Charlie called into the microphone.
Gjork? Report!
The doctor pointed up at the screen that displayed the local weather conditions. A sequence of figures was flaring over the reference point of the mining party.
I'm very much afraid there's been a hit and run.
Charlie stiffened.
Gjork? And the boys? What do you mean?
Pierpoint,
said the doctor bitterly.
He's a malicious old stick. He burnt them away just because he felt like it.
Charlie stood up. There was a determined set to his features again.
Right,
he said. The doctor looked up at him.
You've decided on a course of action, I can tell.
Charlie turned to the nearest Ogron.
Benorg, tie him to the chair.
The doctor spluttered and attempted to rise, but a firm Ogron hand pushed him down again. Benorg unwound a length of white plastic flex from his belt pouch and wrapped it around the doctor's waist and the chair, taking care to keep the hands of the prisoner apart by use of a simple but very stubborn-looking knot.
This is very ungrateful of you, the doctor protested.
I know,
said Charlie.
But you're the law.
He tapped the doctor on the shoulder.
No hard feelings.
I shall feel much better knowing that. Just what are you up to?
Charlie scrabbled in his pocket and brought out a small black box with a red button mounted on top.
Know what this is, Doctor?
Well, it looks like a signaling device to me.
It is.
Charlie tossed the box from hand to hand.
And when me and Benorg and the rest of the lads are far enough away from this planet, I'm going to use it to detonate that.
He pointed. The doctor saw the outline of the bomb underneath the main console.
It doesn't look very big,
he said.
Size is unimportant, said Charlie. That bomb contains enough fine hermite to blow this base apart. And that's not all, you know. 'Cause this place has a fission generator beneath it. And when that catches light, well, there's not going to be much left of the planet after that.
Stokes lifted the tattered edge of the tarpaulin again and raised his head slightly. From this position, he could see out of the clear bubble on top of the skimmer and onto the surface of Planet 11. The place looked fairly much as he had imagined it. Dirty and blue. Occasionally, a brighter splash of chemical would flash up in the greasy, slow-moving clouds they were pushing through, but these were soon swallowed by the prevailing stodge. Stokes vowed that if he lived to take up oils again, blue would never form part of his compositions. He had seen more than enough of the wretched color. The skimmer was moving at an incredible rate, he thought. Its preset course was leading it towards a large black shape that loomed up ahead. As they came closer, he saw that there was more than one of these shapes. They were no higher than tall hills, but given the flatness of the planet's surface, they reared up like mighty mountains. Their foremost peaks pointed solidly up from the gas clouds. His stomach lurched as the skimmer banked and began to slow. A structure at the foot of the nearest mountain came into view. It was small, about half the size of the McConaughey base, and hugged the slope of the mountain with coiling metal pipelines. Its central section was oblong. It had no windows or external markings, and the rigors of the planet's atmosphere had covered it with dirt. The side facing the approaching skimmer had been partly buried under a cascade of sand, but the rudimentary docking port, little more than a large hole surrounded by a ring of securing clamps, had fortunately escaped the avalanche. Stokes raised his head as high as he dared and peeked forward through the gap in the seating. He saw Romana's outstretched body and Pierpoint's hand reaching out to make manual guidance corrections. Trust that old fraudster to take a young woman as a hostage. If Stokes had been a more valiant man, he would have been planning the rescue of the girl. But he was not, and so he slunk back into cover and gnawed his knuckles in terror as the skimmer slid to a halt, and he heard the clamps swing out to secure it. In their flight through the darkened, stuffy corridors of the illegal mine, Spigot and K9 had seen many more dormant robots standing among the machinery. It was just as well, Spigot reasoned, that he had seen fit to activate the one that was in for repair. The thought of confronting a fully functional member of this robotic race would have brought him out in a sweat if he hadn't already been sweating from the exertion of running. He grasped hold of a staircase that ran along one wall and swung himself under it. He panted and collapsed against the wall, trying to catch his breath. K9 turned.
Query, you're stopping. We must avoid pursuing robots.
The clank of the approaching machine echoed down the corridor towards them. "Hold on," Spigot gasped. "Why don't you let me set up an ambush? Lure it along this way, then you blast it with your nose ray."
Plan impractical. My defensive capability may be ineffective against mining robots. Insufficient data on its design.
Spigot waved a hand desperately. "That control panel on its chest. Try blasting that away, eh? It's our only chance." He wiped his brow. "And sometimes you have to take a chance in life, K9. Follow your instincts. It's how I've survived all these years." K9 regarded him skeptically.
My logic circuits refute your arguments.
His sensors swiveled.
However, a check on my power reserves indicates that at present speed, utility will cease in 25 minutes. To preserve power, I must take action.
Spigot watched as K9 turned and settled himself in the middle of the corridor. The nose blaster slid from his muzzle. "Good boy, K9, Spigot called. "Don't let me down now." K9's eye screen flashed angrily.
This unit has never failed you. Your inefficiency has impaired my actions at a rate of 85.43.
The robot appeared at the end of the corridor, wobbling uncertainly on its base. Its serrated probe sliced the air ahead of it, and its head whirred from side to side, searching its prey.
Interesting,
said K9.
Inferior design of close tactile sensors. I have the advantage.
The robot came closer, its stare fixed on the immobile K9, and it stopped for a moment, apparently confused. The delay was all that K9 needed. He aimed for the robot's chest unit and let out a concentrated laser blast. The mining robot's appendages went haywire. Smoke started to issue from its shoulders. It managed to release a feeble response to the attack from its eyes, but the twin beams succeeded only in scorching the floor. The machine clicked, groaned, and sagged. K9 cut off his own laser beam and beeped proudly.
Robot deactivated.
Spigot emerged from his hiding place. "Hey, well done, little fella." Suddenly, a distant clang sounded, followed by a scraping noise. Spigot nodded. "Sounds like we've got visitors." Stokes waited until he heard the door of the skimmer slam shut after Pierpoint and Romana, before he dared lift his head. The vehicle had come to rest in a small, bare metallic chamber that adjoined the airlock. Pierpoint, carrying the supine form of Romana, was standing before a door that obviously led to the main section of this place. Whatever it was. The old judge raised a finger to the chamber's entry coder and tapped in a recognition code. Stokes squinted to make out the letters that appeared on the tiny screen. They made up the word Sentinel. The door clicked open and Pierpoint stepped through. Stokes would have been quite prepared to remain in the skimmer, but he noticed a dial on the airlock's atmosphere gauge, swinging from green to red. A poor spacefarer he may have been, but he knew enough about basic safety to realize what was happening. In minutes, the air would be sucked out. He pushed open the door of the skimmer and tumbled out, clutching at his throat, which already felt dry and constricted. His only hope was that the door would respond to the same code being used twice. He hurried over and slowly punched in the word Sentinel. The door swung open and he darted through. Fortunately, his fellow passengers had already moved off and he was alone in a corridor that was even darker and less comfortable than those of the survey base. He barely had time to register the unpleasant details of his surroundings before a strange whirring noise issued from the darkness up ahead. He looked about frantically, but there was no exit except for the airlock door. He sank to his knees and clasped his hands together. "Please, please," he murmured to whatever celestial force might be listening. "Make it as swift and as painless as possible." He screwed his eyes tight.
"Fear unnecessary,"
said a high-pitched electronic voice. Stokes opened an eye curiously. "K9! How did you get here?" Despite his exhaustion, he found his lips curling upwards in a grateful smile. Perhaps things weren't so bad after all. At least now he had company. Another figure appeared from the shadows. "I hadn't expected to be seeing you again," said Spigot. "Thought you'd probably been blasted by those Nisbets." Stokes pulled himself up. Oddly, the presence of this uncouth upstart galvanized him far more effectively than the terrors of the past few hours. The fellow was such a bore. All he ever did was talk about himself. "I have come here in pursuit of our true enemy," Stokes said grandly. "The Nisbet menace is as nothing when compared to the improbity of High Archon Pierpoint." He relished in the revelation of the name. "Pierpoint?" queried Spigot. "What's he got to do with it?" "He has come here carrying the fair Romana as his captive," Stokes explained. "He has led Zeus and the Nisbets, not to mention the great Doctor himself, a pretty dance." K9 spoke.
"Sensors indicate presence of the mistress. However, her psychospore trail is obscured by a rogue trace."
"Exactly," said Stokes. "That'll be the Zeus mask. She is wearing it."
Spigot laid a heavy hand on Stokes' shoulder. "I think, mate, before we do anything else, all three of us had best find a quiet corner, sit down, and try to sort out just what's going on here."
"It is not possible for me to sit down,"
said K9.
"but I concur with your strategy. More information is needed before rescue plan can be devised."
One of the large mining robots stood dormant before a plain metal door further into the mine. As Pierpoint, who was still carrying Romana, advanced, its eyes lit up and one of its arms shot up.
"Sentinel," said Pierpoint warily. "Grant access."
The robot slid to one side and the door slid open. The room beyond had been designed for a specific purpose. It was dominated by an angled dais that had 4 metal clamps built into it. Above the dais, bulging from the ceiling, was a complex array of machinery. Sprouting from its center was a slim metal probe. Above this device was a transparent panel built into the wall. Pierpoint arranged the body of Romana on the dais and secured her arms and legs in the clamps. When he was satisfied that she was safely tied up, he left the room. Romana began to stir uneasily in her bonds. The jowls of the living mask twitched with hate-filled dreams. Benorg marched into the survey room.
"Mr. Charles, ready to leave, sir."
A large pulse had started to throb in Charlie's thick neck, making his shirt collar dance in time to the vein pumping on his forehead. He finished off his soup and screwed the lid of the flask back on.
"Good."
Benorg saluted and gestured to the gathered Ogrons. They started to file noisily back out of the survey room. Charlie made to follow them. The doctor coughed politely from the chair where he had been bound.
Aren't you going to say goodbye?
No.
If you were a real gentleman, you'd shoot me. Pressing buttons and blowing people up, it's all a bit modern, isn't it? Rather gauche, wouldn't you say?
Charlie sauntered over.
Well, one thing this experience has taught me, Doctor, the old days are finished.
He knelt and whispered in the doctor's ear.
As a lawman, I'm sure you appreciate it too. When the Nisbet firm was in its prime, the streets were safe. You can't deny it. Now there's hooligans and punks and God knows what running riot in the streets, and bent judges and coppers playing at rackets, and all the big companies busting each other up.
He wiped a small tear from his eye.
Me mum and dad would cry to see things today, they would. All the lies and tricks. It was always the golden rule. Never mess on your own patch.
Crime isn't what it was,
the doctor agreed. Charlie stood.
You're right there. Well, goodbye. You're a decent bloke for a copper, you know.
He took a last look at the body of his brother and left the survey room. Left alone at last, the doctor decided it was time to deal with his bonds. He held in his breath and shrugged his shoulders, but the knots remained as tight as ever. Surely the Ogrons couldn't be that good at tying knots. Far cleverer people had tied him to things and he'd managed to escape. He strained to free his wrists, but had no success. This was going to take some time. Zeus's eyes opened, the fluid silver sockets of the mask framing the clear blue eyes of Romana. Her exultant sneer became a frown of alarm as she felt the clamps securing her to the platform in the small room and saw the thin probe angled directly at her. A voice that she recognized came from a speaker somewhere close by.
So you have woken.
Pierpoint! She screamed and tried to sit up. You will release me immediately! Above the machine facing her was a faintly illuminated gallery. Seated within was her supposed ally.
I want the formula for the activation process, Zeus,
Pierpoint said calmly.
You will give me the formula now.
Zeus laughed. You are such a fool. I have the power to burn through these bonds and crush you where you stand. Already a glow was forming around her eyes. She saw Pierpoint lean forward and press a button on the console beneath him. A blue light flooded the chamber, accompanied by a strange, unwavering note.
The room you are inside has now been charged with Stavender's radiation. If you release one rad of your own powers, the reaction will weaken the structure of your host body.
Zeus twisted and turned in frustration. No! Pierpoint continued, his smooth tones as untroubled as they had ever been when pronouncing judgment in the courtroom.
And you need a host to activate the helicon, Zeus. Without a living mind, you cannot power the transfer of your consciousness. Am I right?
Zeus grunted and struggled in her bonds. His voice became mocking.
You thought you were in control, Zeus. Bringing in the Nisbet brothers behind my back, the alliance was doomed from the start. As was our own arrangement. I realized how you intended to use me. I knew you would never work with a normal.
Release me, growled Zeus. This new host has closed her mind to me. But I sense great powers there. We can share them. Pierpoint shook his head.
I want the formula, Zeus. All these years I have been preparing for this moment.
He gestured around him.
I have mined the helicon from this planet. You will activate it for me, or die.
I cannot die, Zeus wailed up at him.
But without a host, he taunted her. What then? You are powerless.
Zeus drummed her fists on the platform. When I am free, old normal, I will strip the flesh from your bones and bathe myself in your blood. The Ogron's spaceship may have been old, but it was dependable enough. With a mighty roar that blew gathering dirt from its rocket ports, it lifted from the launch pad outside the McConaughey base, turned to steady itself, and soared up and away. On the cluttered bridge of the ship, Charlie settled himself in his armchair and looked across to its empty counterpart. His eyes flicked up to the portrait of his mother.
"They're going to pay, all right," he vowed.
"Preparing to depart atmosphere of Planet 11,
called Flark from the flight position.
"Good,"
said Charlie.
"We'll give it 10 minutes and then blow the charge."
He sat back in his chair, took hold of the armrests, and closed his eyes, breathing deeply in an effort to calm himself. Spigot, Stokes, and K9 had found shelter back in the repair room where the TARDIS had materialized. Stokes had shown particular interest in the police box, which had proved the claims made for it beyond doubt, but had been persuaded by the others to relate the complex story of Pierpoint's plan as far as he understood it. As Spigot listened, K9 had wandered off into a corner and was sniffing out what appeared to be some kind of long-range transmitter unit.
"Always reckoned he was a strange old guy," said Spigot, "to devote himself totally to the law like he did. I mean to say, even I've found time for a personal life over the years."
"I know," said Stokes hastily. "What puzzles me is how he managed to set this place up." Spigot shrugged.
"Well, he's got the contacts and the money. Probably hired a pirate."
"Wait a moment." Stokes thought back to the last set of terminations. "Now I come to think of it, Pierpoint had some rogue miner chap sent to the Reverser the other day. Welt or somebody. Who's to say he didn't construct this place on orders from Pierpoint, who then had him framed to keep him quiet?"
"You're probably right," said Spigot. "Funny thing, but I thought Pierpoint had principles. He's an old-fashioned type. The last of his breed, probably."
"Repressed," was Stokes' judgment, "and probably quite insane. All those years dishing out death sentences convinced him that he was God and could do anything he liked. He appears to have been running our entire system for the last 15 years, at any rate. From both sides of the law. And just look at that code name he uses. Sentinel. Pah! The arrogance." Spigot looked up abruptly.
"Sentinel?"
Stokes nodded. "Yes. Unbelievable, isn't it? He sees himself as some sort of guardian for the rest of society, I imagine."
Spigot licked his lips. "When the Nisbet firm were brought in," he said, "some of the smaller fry cracked under questioning. They came out with a story that they'd been betrayed by some contact in the establishment. Nobody believed it." He gripped Stokes' arm. "And the code name they had for this guy was Sentinel."
"I suppose it's likely," Stokes said. "The Nisbet firm were rather more successful criminals than their appearance would suggest. They could have had help." He coughed. "Would you mind taking your hand away?"
Spigot let go and clapped his hands together. "Pierpoint was behind the Nisbet firm, and he betrayed them when it suited him." He smiled. "I bet they wouldn't mind finding that out. They might even do our job for us, eh?" Before Stokes could reply, K9 turned from his examination of the machine in the corner.
"This device is a long-range transmitter,"
he said.
"I intend to use it to contact the Dr. Master at the McConaughey Mining Survey Base and request assistance."
"Hold on a moment," said Spigot, his eyes gleaming with enthusiasm.
"I might have a better use for it."
The doctor tensed his arm muscles and tugged again at the knot around his left wrist. He felt it give way slightly, but realized there was no way he was going to get free before the bombs went off. Perhaps there was another way. With difficulty, he wrenched the chair he was tied to from its holding and hopped, still attached to the chair, over to the console under which the bomb had been placed. He knelt down as far as he was able, took a look at the device, and turned.
Even with the sonic screwdriver, I couldn't defuse it in time.
At such moments, he was used to some miraculous means of deliverance to present itself. None seemed to be forthcoming on this occasion.
"My only hope," he told himself, "is to stop Nisbet sending the detonation signal."
Spurred on by the desperate nature of the situation, he tugged once more at the knots around his wrists, and this time succeeded in freeing his left hand. He hurried over to the communications console and tapped out a frantic all frequencies alert. A red light started to flash, indicating that a call had been picked up. The doctor sighed with relief and waited for the channel to open. "Come on, come on." At last, a guttural voice came from the communicator, masked by heavy static.
What do you want?
"This is the doctor, calling from the survey base. I need to speak to your master about something rather important." There was a prolonged pause. Flark looked over his shoulder. Mr. Charles was leaning back in his chair and sleeping. He could not be disturbed, whatever the problem. It was not done to wake the boss. And he needed his rest after all.
"No, you can't speak to him,"
Flark told the doctor.
"He is resting."
"But this is urgent,"
said the doctor.
"I just remembered something I must tell him. I'm speaking with his interests at heart."
Flark's brow creased.
"You speak as friend?"
I suppose so."
"Mr. Nisbet has no friends. Everyone hates him. You are lying, and I shall not listen."
Flark clicked off the call. The doctor thumped his fist down on the communicator console. It seemed there was no way out. Another red light started to flash on the console. Somebody else was transmitting a message from the planet's surface.
"Detective Inspector Frank Spigot to Charles and Edward Nisbet,"
a familiar voice said from the console.
"Who are you? Are you an enemy of Mr. Nisbet?"
Came the voice of Flark.
"Well, you could say that,"
said Spigot. Charlie Nisbet's dreams were taking him back to the old days. He and Eddie were standing together under the canopy over the main doorway of the Imperial Club in West Coppertown. Their shining black shoes sank deep into the plush red carpet. The punters were queuing up along the street, all in line, the lads in their smartest suits and the girls in their prettiest frocks. It was going to be a good night. One of the best bands from Capital were inside just striking up. There'd be drinks aplenty and the finest nosh. And then later, the firm were going to take a van over to the Cog and Centrifuge and collect some money that was owing. The town clock struck 10, and the boys stepped forward to admit the first group of punters into the lobby. A distant voice said,
"Mr. Charles, sir, a message from the planet."
Charlie looked around the crowd. Standing right at the front of the queue was a right ugly. Covered in hair, it looked like an upright 8.
"Mr. Nisbet, sir,"
it said,
"there is a message for you."
He jolted upright in his chair and was immediately transported 30 years forwards in time. Flark was tugging nervously at his sleeve. For a moment, Charlie thought he was going to shout at the hapless Ogron for waking him up. Then he realized that the pilot was about the nearest he could now call to next of kin. There was something oddly familiar and comforting about that huge, brutish face. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes.
"A message? From where?"
Flark pointed to the console.
"From planet, sir. Comes from man called Spigot."
Charlie raised a suspicious eyebrow.
"Never heard of him. Patch it through."
"I hear you've been casting about for a chap calling himself Sentinel,"
the doctor heard Spigot say. The doctor tried to pull his hands to his head in alarm, but of course they were still tied to the chair, and he succeeded only in pulling the muscles of his upper back.
"No,"
he cried.
"The idiot!"
Charlie straightened in his chair. His eyes narrowed.
"What if I am?"
"What if I told you, Mr. Nisbet,"
Spigot continued,
"that I know exactly where you can find this person? You'd be interested, eh?"
"I'd be very interested."
The doctor hammered frantically at the communicator controls in the survey room, desperately searching for a way to block the frequency connecting Spigot with the Ogron's ship. The control panel before which Pierpoint was seated bleeped urgently. He took his eyes from the writhing form of Zeus below and checked the reading. He frowned.
"A message being sent from the base?"
he asked aloud.
"That is impossible."
Concerned that an instrumentation failure might have occurred, he broke into the transmission frequency to check the reading. The voices of Spigot and Charlie Nisbet came through clearly.
You claim to know the identity of Sentinel?
Charlie was asking.
Oh, better than that, Charlie, my mate.
Spigot replied.
I know where you can find him.
Pierpoint leapt up. The sound of the conversation had carried from the gallery to the room below. Zaius looked up, deep frown lines forming on the forehead of the mask. And then she smiled.
Where?
Charlie barked into his communicator link.
Where can I find him?
He shuddered with emotion.
You'd better not be messing me around, copper.
Spigot said confidently.
I wouldn't mess your sort about. No, I've got Sentinel right here, Charlie. You'd know him better as High Archon Pierpoint.
Stokes looked on anxiously as Spigot made his revelation. He whispered to K9. I'm not altogether sure about this. Something about this message makes me feel extremely uneasy. He took another look at Spigot. An uneasiness that probably has something to do with the fact that the person sending the message is a total and absolute idiot.
I am not programmed to express critical opinions,
said K9.
Pierpoint!
Charlie clamped his hands on the arm of his chair, his knuckles whitening.
Pierpoint! Buddy! Buddy!
His mind filled up with an explosive mixture of feelings. The first raid on the firm's premises, the lads being led away, him and Eddie fleeing to Galuris, reading in the papers about the executions of his oldest mates.
But I've had him next to me, he spluttered. All this flaming time, he spat. No wonder that filthy cow Zaius wanted to keep him alive. It wouldn't surprise me if they were all in it together. Pierpoint, Zaius, the doctor.
He turned back to the communicator.
You say he's with you, Spigot?
At his secret mine. Why not come and get him? I bet you've got plenty to talk about.
Spigot broke off the call. There we go, Spigot said confidently, turning to face his colleagues. Now we can just pop back into the TARDIS over there and wait for the brothers Nisbet to deal with our problem for us. Stokes shrugged. I suppose it sounds reasonable enough. The communicator bleeped. Surprised, Spigot reopened the channel. Hello, Mr. Nisbet? Any details you want clearing up?
Spigot,
said the doctor's voice.
You are a total and absolute idiot.
Zaius chuckled. Well, Sentinel, what is your plan now? She smirked up through the glass at Pierpoint, who was pacing the gallery in agitation.
It doesn't matter, he said. Even if their ship was able to make a landing here, which I doubt, it doesn't possess the weapons necessary to break in. This mine is protected by neutron cannon. I am secure.
Charlie Nisbet's voice crackled over the communicator link.
Pierpoint,
he thundered.
this is Nisbet.
I have nothing to say to you, said Pierpoint.
Scum.
Charlie's voice broke with emotion.
You're behind all of this. I wish I was there to bust you open with my own hands. I want you to suffer like my family suffered. It's too bad it's going to have to end this way.
Pierpoint stiffened.
What do you mean? You cannot reach me here. Go away.
You're wrong on that score. See, the survey base is wired to blow up when I give the word. There's enough Hermite stored there to crack open the reactor core.
He paused.
And when that goes, the planet goes.
I do not believe you, said Pierpoint.
You know what? Of all the people I've ever met, I hate you most of all.
The transmission ceased. Charlie's warning had been overheard on the open channel by Spigot. Oh, damn, he said. Can he really blow up the planet like that? He can't. Can he?
I'm can,
said the doctor from the base.
and as I happen to be sitting directly on top of the bomb, I'm not too happy about it.
He tutted.
Really, Spigot, I was just about to win Nisbet over. Couldn't you just use a little intelligence?
How was I to know? The detective protested. He flinched under the accusing glare of Stokes. Well, at least the galaxy will be a better place without Zeus and Pierpoint anyway. Stokes slapped him and turned his back. K9's head dropped, and he trundled away. If the reactor at the McConaughey base blows, you will die, Zeus called up to Pierpoint. The base is built on the junction of fault lines that will bring the Jilharo Mountains down on this place. You are finished. Pierpoint drummed his fingers on the console before him.
You will die with me.
Zeus shook her head. No, the mask will resist the explosion. And besides, you have gathered the helicon here. When it is released, I shall activate it and my plan will succeed. Only you will have failed, a victim of your own cunning. She waited and then added, There is an alternative, of course. He stood up and stared down at her.
What?
Release me, she said, gesturing to the clamps securing her wrists and ankles. Free me, and I will save you. I can use the helicon you have gathered to protect you. I will activate it and transfer your consciousness in minutes. We will both become immortal. Or would you prefer to die?
Why should you want me alive?
Pierpoint asked her. You'll never know until you release me, Zeus pleaded. You must release me. Pierpoint, unsure but aware of the desperate nature of his predicament, leant forward and pressed a button. The hum of the radiation probe stopped, and the lighting in the room below returned to normal. The clamps on the platform clicked open. Zeus sat upright. A beam shot from her forehead. It shattered the glass of the gallery. Pierpoint, taken by surprise, threw himself back, his left arm raised to protect himself from the blast. He fell forward over the console, his body shattered. Zeus laughed cruelly and stepped from the platform. The long, blonde hair of Romana cascaded down her back as she put her hands on her hips in a characteristically arrogant pose. She looked up. Goodbye, Nisbet, she said. Flark lifted his head from the flight position.
We are ready to make warp jump, sir.
Charlie gripped the detonator box in his hand. He looked up at the picture hanging above the bridge. This one's for you, he told its subject. A tear trickled down one pudgy cheek. This one's for the firm. Rev down for warp, Flark. The Ogron nodded and flicked over a series of switches. The ship's engine noise altered in pitch to a protesting grumble. Flark cocked his head.
Something is wrong,
he said. Smoke started to waft from the panel in front of him.
I will check the computer.
He consulted the ship's fault tracer diagnostic system. A long list of faulty components flashed up. At the top, a string of numbers flashed in red. Flark gasped.
What? Computer is not working right. Engines are not working. Rockets won't stop.
Charlie leapt up from his chair.
Close them down! If we try going into warp with rockets still active, we'll be...
The program set by Zeus activated the moment the ship's warp engines were primed. A command tripped the safety checks on the rocket motors. The explosion ripped through the Ogron ship in less than a second as the warp stress tore open the active rocket fuel. The ship's black, skeletal frame was revealed in the moment before the fireball blossomed, sending the now unrecognizable mass of twisted metal hurtling back down through the atmosphere of Planet 11. Gravity delivered it to the grasping gas clouds, which burst around it and consumed it with sky-splitting fury.